and I am reading out of the Interlinear Bible. And Jehovah said to Samuel, How long will you mourn for Saul? For I have rejected him from reigning over Israel. Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have seen a king for me among his sons. And Samuel said, How can I go? When Saul hears, then he will kill me. And Jehovah said, You shall take a heifer from the herd of your hand, and shall say, I have come to sacrifice to Jehovah. And you invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will make you know what you shall do. And you shall anoint for me whomever I say to you. And Samuel did what Jehovah said, and came to Bethlehem. And the elders of the city trembled to meet him, and said, Do you come in peace? And he said, Peace, I have come to sacrifice to Jehovah. Sanctify yourselves, and you shall come to me to the sacrifice. And he sanctified Jesse and his sons, and called them to the sacrifice. And it happened, as they came in, that he saw Eliab, and said, Surely his anointed is before Jehovah. And Jehovah said to Samuel, Do not look on his appearance, nor to the height of his stature, for I have rejected him. For man does not see what he sees. For man looks for the eyes, but Jehovah, looks for the heart. And Jesse called to Abinadab, and he passed him before Samuel, but he said, Also Jehovah has not chosen this one. And Jesse passed to Shammah but he said, Also Jehovah has not chosen this one. And Jesse passed 7 of his sons before Samuel. But Samuel said to Jesse, Jehovah has not chosen among these. And Samuel said to Jesse, Are these all the young men? And he said, There yet remains the youngest, and behold, he is tending the flock. And Samuel said to Jesse, Send and bring him, for we will not sit until he comes here. And he sent and brought him in, and he was ruddy, with beautiful eyes and good form. And Jehovah said, Rise up, anoint him, for this is he. And Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of Jehovah came upon David from that day and onward. And Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. And the Spirit of Jehovah departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from Jehovah terrified him. And Saul's servant said to him, Behold, now an evil spirit from God is terrifying you. Please let our Lord say to your servants before you, Let them seek out a man who knows how to play on the harp. And it shall be when the evil spirit from God is upon you, then he shall play with his hand, and it shall be well with you. And Saul said to his servants, Now look for a man who is good at playing for me, and bring him to me. One of the servants answered and said, Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, and a mighty warrior, and a man of battle, and skillful in speech, and a man of form, and Jehovah is with him. And Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, Send your son David to me, who is with the flock. And Jesse took an ass with bread, and a skin of wine, and 1 kid of the goats. And he sent by the hand of his son David to Saul. And David came to Saul and stood before him. And he loved him greatly, and he became his armor-bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, Please let David stand before me, for he has found grace in my eyes. And it happened when the evil spirit from God was on Saul, then David would take the harp and play with his hand. And there was relief for Saul, and it was well with him, and the evil spirit would depart from him. Chapter 17 of 1 Samuel. And the Philistines had gathered their armies for battle, and were gathered at Succoth of Judah. And they camped between Succoth and Azekah in Ephes Demim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and camped in the valley of Elah. And they set the battle in order to meet the Philistines, and the Philistines stood on the mountain on this side, and Israel stood on the mountain on that side, and the valley between them. And a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines. Goliath was his name. From Gath his height was 6 cubits and a span. And a bronze helmet was on his head. And he was clothed with scale body armor, and the weight of the body armor was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And a covering of bronze was on his legs, and a javelin of bronze between his shoulders. And the wood of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the blade of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. And the shield bearer went before him, and he stood and called to the ranks of Israel, and said to them, Why do you come out to set in order the battle? Am I not the Philistine, and you Saul's servants? Choose one for yourselves, and let him come to me. If he is able to fight with me and strike me, then we shall become slaves to you. But if I am able to win over him and to strike him, then you shall become slaves to us, and shall serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man, and we will fight together. And Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, and they were broken down and greatly afraid. And David was the son of a man, this one an Ephrathite, from Bethlehem of Judah, and his name was Jesse. And to him were 8 sons, and the man was old among men in the days of Saul. And the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went out. They went after Saul to the battle. And the name of his 3 sons who went into the battle, Eliab, the firstborn, and his second, Abinadab, and the third, Shammah. And David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest had gone after Saul. And David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's flock at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near morning and evening, and presented himself 40 days. And Jesse said to his son David, Please take to your brothers an ephah of this roasted grain and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to your brothers. And you shall take these 10 cuttings of cheese to the commander of the 1,000. And you shall visit your brothers as to how they fare. And you shall bring their token. And Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper, and got up and went as Jesse commanded him. And he came to the barricade and to the army which was going out to the battle array. And they were shouting for battle. And Israel and Philistines set up in battle array for rank to meet rank. And David left the goods on him into the hands of the storekeeper, and ran to the army. And he came and asked his brothers of their welfare. And he was speaking to them, and behold, the champion man, his name being Goliath, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines. And he spoke according to these words, and David heard. And when they saw the man, all the men of Israel ran from him, and were very much afraid. And the men of Israel said, Have you seen the man who comes up? For he has come to defy Israel. And it shall be the man who strikes him, the king, will enrich him with great riches, and he will give his daughter to him, and he will make his father's house free in Israel. And David spoke to the men who were standing with him, saying, What shall be done to the man who strikes the Philistine, and turns aside reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should reproach the armies of the living God? And the people spoke to him according to this word, saying, So shall it be done to the man who strikes him. And his eldest brother Eliab heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger burned against David. And he said, Why is it you have come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, What I have done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned around from him to another and said the same word. And the people answered him a word like the first word. And the words which David had spoken were heard. And they were told before Saul, and he received him. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and will fight with the Philistine. And Saul said to David, You are not able to go to this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth. And David said to Saul, Your servant has been a shepherd among sheep for his father. And the lion came and the bear and took away a sheep out of the flock. And I went out after him and smote him, and delivered out of his mouth, and he arose against me. And I took hold of his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck both the lion and the bear. And this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, for he has reproached the armies of the living God. And David said, Jehovah, who has delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he shall deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said to David, Go, and Jehovah be with you. And Saul clothed David with his apparel, and put a bronze helmet on his head, and clothed him with body armor. And David girded his sword on his apparel, and started to go. But he had not tested these. And David said to Saul, I am not able to go with thee, for I have not tested. And David took them off him. And he took his staff in his hand and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and he put them in the shepherd's bag which he had, even in his pouch. And his sling was in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine. And the Philistine came on, coming and drawing near to David, and the shield-bearer was before him. And the Philistine looked, and he saw David, and disdained him, for he was a youth, even ruddy, with a handsome form. And the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog, that you have come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the heavens, and to the beasts of the field. And David said to the Philistine, You are coming to me with sword, and with spear, and with javelin. But I am coming to you in the name of Jehovah of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, which you have reproached. Today Jehovah shall shut you up into my hand, and I shall strike you, and take off your head from you, and give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the heavens, and to the beasts of the earth today. And all the earth shall know that there is a God for Israel. And all this company shall know that Jehovah does not save by sword and by spear, but that the battle belongs to Jehovah, and he has given you into our hand. And it happened when the Philistine arose and went and drew near to meet David, David hurried and ran toward the ranks to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand into the vessel and took a stone from there. And he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead. And the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. And David was stronger than the Philistine with the sling and with the stone. And he struck the Philistine and killed him. And there was no sword in David's hand. And David ran and stood over the Philistine, and took his sword, and he drew it out of its sheath, and killed him. And he cut off his head with it. And the Philistines saw that their warrior was dead, and they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose up and shouted, and pursued the Philistines until you enter the valley, even to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell in the way of Shaaraim, even to Gath and to Ekron. And the sons of Israel returned from the hotly pursuing the Philistines, and they pillaged their camps. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, and he put his weapons in his own tent. And when Saul saw David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, the army commander, Whose son is this youth, Abner? And Abner said, As your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And the king said, You ask whose son this young man is. And when David returned from striking the Philistine, then Abner took him and brought him before Saul. And the head of the Philistine was in his hand. And Saul said to him, Whose son are you, my boy? And David said, The son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. Chapter 18 of 1 Samuel. And it happened when he finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knitted with the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day, and would not let him return to his father's house. And Jonathan and David cut a covenant, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him, and gave it to David, also his apparel, even to his sword, and to his bow, or bow, and his belt. And David went out wherever Saul sent him, and he acted wisely, and Saul set him over the men of war. And it was good in the eyes of all the people, and also in the eyes of Saul's servants. And it happened as they came in, as David returned from striking the Philistine, the women came out from all the cities of Israel to sing with the dancers, to meet Saul the king with timbrels, and with joy, and 3-stringed instruments. And the women who were playing answered and said, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his myriads. And it very much burned Saul. And this thing was evil in his eyes. And he said, They have given myriads to David, and to me they have given thousands. And if is there more to him except the kingdom? And from that day forward, Saul was watching David. And on the next day it happened that the evil spirit from God came on Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house, and David was playing with his hand. as he did day by day. And Saul's spear was in his hand, and Saul threw the spear, and said, I will strike David, even to the wall. And David twice drew back from his presence. And Saul feared David, because Jehovah was with him, and had departed from Saul. And Saul separated him from himself. And he went out and came in before the people, and David acted wisely in all his ways, and Jehovah was with him. And Saul saw that he was acting wisely, and was afraid of him. And all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. And Saul said to David, Behold, my elder daughter Merab, I will give her to you for a wife. Only you be a brave son for me, and fight the battles of Jehovah. And Saul said, Let not my hand be on him, but let the hand of the Philistines be on him. And David said to Saul, Who am I, and what my life, and the family of my father in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? And it happened at the time Saul was to give his daughter Merab to David. She was given to Adriel the Mahalathite for a wife. And Saul's daughter Michal loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing was right in his eyes. And Saul said, I will give her to him, and she shall be a snare to him. And the hand of the Philistine shall be on him. And Saul said to David a second time, You shall be my son-in-law today. And Saul commanded his servants, Speak to David secretly, saying, Behold, the king delights in you, and all his servants love you. And now be son-in-law to the king. And Saul's servants spoke these words in David's ears. And David said, Is it a light thing in your eyes to be son-in-law to a king, or to the king? And I am poor, a poor man, and lightly esteemed. And Saul's servants spoke to him, saying, David has spoken according to these words. And Saul said, So you shall say to David, There is no delight to the king in dowry, but in 100 foreskins of the Philistines, to be avenged on the king's enemies. And Saul thought to cause David to fall by the hand of the Philistines. And his servants told David these words, and the thing was right in David's eyes to be son-in-law to the king. And the days had not been fulfilled, and David rose up and went out, he and his men. And they struck 200 men of the Philistines, and David brought their foreskins, and he gave them in full to the king, in order to be son-in-law to the king. And Saul gave him his daughter Michal for a wife. And Saul saw and knew that Jehovah was with David, and that Michal, the daughter of Saul, loved him. And Saul was still more afraid of David. And Saul was an enemy to David continually. And the rulers of the Philistines came out, and it happened from that time they came out, David acted more wisely than all the servants of Saul, and his name was greatly esteemed. Chapter 19 of 1 Samuel. And Saul spoke to his son Jonathan, and to all his servants to kill David. And Saul's son Jonathan delighted exceedingly in David. And Jonathan told David, saying, My father Saul is seeking to kill you. And now please be on the guard in the morning, and you shall stay in the secret place, and shall hide. And I will go out and stand by my father's side in the field where you are. And I will speak of you to my father, and shall see what it is, and will tell you. And Jonathan spoke good things of David to his father Saul, and said to him, Do not let the king sin against his servant, against David, because he has not sinned against you. Also because his works for you are very good. Yea, he has put his life in his hand, and killed the Philistine. And Jehovah worked a great deliverance for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. And why do you sin against innocent blood, to put David to death for no reason? And Saul listened to Jonathan's voice, and Saul swore, As Jehovah lives, he shall not die. And Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all these words. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was before him as yesterday and the day before. And there was war again. And David went out and fought against the Philistines, and struck among them with a great slaughter, and they fled from his face. And the evil spirit from Jehovah was on Saul, and he was sitting in his house, and his spear in his hand, and David was playing with the hand. And Saul tried to strike David with the spear, and thought he would. But he escaped from Saul's presence. and he struck the spear through the wall. And David fled and escaped that night. And Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him and to kill him in the morning. And his wife Michal told David, saying, If you do not escape with your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. And Michal made David go down through the window. And he went and he fled and escaped. And Michal took an image and laid it on the bed. And she put the quilt of goat's hair at his head place and covered with a spread. And Saul sent messengers to take David. And she said, He is sick. And Saul sent the messengers to see David, saying, Bring him up to me in the bed to kill him. And the messengers came in, and behold, the image was on the bed, and the quilt of goat's hair at his head place. And Saul said to Michal, Why have you deceived me this way, that you have sent away my enemy, and he has escaped? And Michal said to Saul, He said to me, Send me away. Why should I kill you? And David fled and escaped, and came to Samuel at Ramah, and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he went, he and Samuel, and they lived in Naioth. And it was told to Saul, saying, Behold, David is in Naioth in Ramah. And Saul sent messengers to take David. And they saw the assembly of the prophets prophesying, and Samuel standing as the head over them. And the Spirit of God came on Saul's messengers, and they also prophesied. And they told Saul, and he sent other messengers, and they also prophesied. And again Saul sent messengers a third time, and they also prophesied. And he went, he also, to Ramah, and came to the great well in Suchi. And Saul asked and said, Where are Samuel and David? And one said, Behold, in Naioth in Ramah. And the Spirit of God came on him also. And going on, he went and prophesied until he came into Naioth in Ramah. And he stripped off his garments, he also, and he prophesied before Samuel, even he. And he fell down, disrobed, all that day and all that night. Because of this they say, Is Saul also among the prophets? Chapter 20 of 1 Samuel. And David fled from Naioth in Ramah, and came and said before Jonathan, What have I done? What is my iniquity, and what my sin before your father, that he is seeking my life? And he said to him, Far be it, you shall not die. Behold, my father shall not do anything, great or small, and not reveal it to my ear. And what should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so. And David again swore and said, Your father has certainly known that I have found favor in your eyes. And he said, Do not let Jonathan know this, that he not be grieved. And yet, as Jehovah lives, and your soul lives, there is only a step between me and death. And Jonathan said to David, What your soul may say, I also will do for you. And David said to Jonathan, Behold, the new moon is tomorrow, and I should certainly sit with the king to eat. And you shall send me away, and I shall be hidden in the field until the third evening. If your father at all looks for me, then you shall say, David asked earnestly of me to run to his city, Bethlehem, for the yearly sacrifice is there for all the family. If he shall say this, good, peace shall be for your servant. But if it burns him greatly, know that evil has been determined by him. And you shall do kindness to your servant, for you have brought your servant with you into a covenant of Jehovah. And if there is iniquity in me, you kill me. For why is this that you bring me to your father? And Jonathan said, Far be it from you. For if I knew with certainty that evil was determined by my father to come on you, would I not tell it to you? Then David said to Jonathan, Who shall tell me? Or what if your father answers harshly? And Jonathan said to David, Come, and we shall go out to the field. And both of them went out to the field. And Jonathan said to David, Jehovah, the God of Israel, be witness, when I probe my father about this time tomorrow, or the third day, and behold, there is good toward David, and I do not sin to you, and do not speak in your ear. So may Jehovah do to Jonathan, and do much more than this. If it should please my father to do evil to you, then I shall speak in your ear, and send you away. And if you shall go in peace, and may Jehovah be with you. And he was as he was with my father. And not only while I live, even you shall not show me the kindness of Jehovah, that I not die. But you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever, not when Jehovah cuts off the enemies of David, each one from off the face of the earth. And Jonathan covenanted with the house of David, that Jehovah should seek it from the hand of David's enemies. And Jonathan again made David swear, because he loved him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. And Jonathan said to him, Tomorrow is the new moon, and you shall be expected, for your seat will be empty. And on the third day you shall quickly come down, and shall come there to the place where you were hidden in the day of the dead. And you shall remain near the stone Ezel. And I will shoot 3 arrows to the side, shooting at a mark for myself. And behold, I shall send a boy, saying, Go find the arrows. If I expressly say to the boy, Behold, the arrows are on this side of you, take them. Then you come, for peace shall be to you. And there is nothing, as Jehovah lives. But if I say to the young man, Behold, the arrows are away from you, and onwards, go, for Jehovah has sent you away. As to the thing which we have spoken, you and I, behold, Jehovah is between you and me forever. And David was hidden in the field, and it was as the new moon. And the king sat down by the food to eat, and the king sat on his seat, as at other times, on the seat by the wall. And Jonathan rose up, and Abner sat at Saul's side, and David's place was empty. But Saul did not say anything on that day, for he said, It is an accident, he is not clean, he is surely not clean. And it happened on the day after the new moon, David's place was empty. And Saul said to his son Jonathan, Why has the son of Jesse not come to the meal, either yesterday or today? And Jonathan answered Saul, David earnestly asked of me to go to Bethlehem. And he said, Please send me away, for we have a family sacrifice in the city. And my brother commanded me. And now, if I have found favor in your eyes, please let me be released and to see my brothers. So he has not come to the table of the king. And the anger of Saul glowed against Jonathan. And he said to him, Son of a perverse rebelliousness, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your shame, and to the shame of of the nakedness of your mother? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on earth, you shall not be established, you and your kingdom. And now send and bring him to me, for he is a son of death. And Jonathan answered his father Saul, and said to him, Why should he be put to death? What has he done? And Saul threw the spear at him to strike him. And Jonathan knew that it had been determined by his father to kill David. And Jonathan arose from the table in the heat of anger, and he did not eat food on the 2nd day of the new moon, for he was grieved for David, for his father had put him to shame. And it happened in the morning that Jonathan went out in the field for the meeting with David, and a little boy was with him. And he said to the boy, Now run and find the arrow which I am shooting. The boy ran, and he shot the arrow, causing it to pass over him. And the boy came to the place of the arrow which Jonathan had shot. And Jonathan called after the boy and said, Is the arrow not away from you and onwards? And Jonathan called after the boy, Hurry, make haste, do not stand. And Jonathan's boy gathered the arrow and came to his master. And the boy did not know anything, only Jonathan and David knew the matter. And Jonathan gave his weapons to the boy with him and said to him, Go carry to the city. And the boy left, and David rose up from the south side. And he fell on his face to the ground, and he bowed 3 times. And they each one kissed his friend. And they each wept on his friend until David exceeded. And Jonathan said to David, Go in peace, because we have sworn, the 2 of us, in the name of Jehovah, saying, Jehovah shall be between you and me, and between my seed and your seed forever. And he rose up and went, and Jonathan went into the city. Join me again as we will continue in 1 Samuel chapter 21 next time.